In January of 1968, 4 young men climbed into a car in London and set off toward a show in Southampton. One of them asked whether they should swing by and collect Syd. Another answered, and that answer has echoed down the rest of rock history. He said, "No, let's not bother." And with those 4 words, the man who had invented Pink Floyd named the band, written nearly every song that made them famous, and imagined the entire sound the world would come to worship, was left standing on a curb in London while the band drove on without him. The 5th man in that car, the one brought in only weeks earlier to cover for Syd Barrett's collapse, was David Gilmour. He was 21 years old. He had known Syd since they were teenagers in Cambridge, had taught him guitar techniques, had hitchhiked through the south of France with him, had watched him become the most magnetic person either of them had ever met. And now, he was sitting in the seat of a man who was being abandoned in real time. A man who was not dead, not gone, simply left behind. We have spent more than 50 years telling this story as the moment Pink Floyd was rescued. I want to tell it as the moment David Gilmour was sentenced. Because here is the thing almost no one says plainly. Gilmour did not replace Syd Barrett. No one replaced Syd Barrett. You cannot replace a founder. You cannot replace the person who gave the thing its name and its first face. What Gilmour inherited was not a vacant chair. It was a haunting. He was asked to walk into a band that was still warm with the presence of the man it had just discarded, to play in rooms that still smelled of him, to write songs that the audience would always, somewhere underneath, be listening to in the hope of hearing the other one. That is not a promotion. That is a sentence served in the open, for life. And consider what the sentence demanded. Gilmour had to become the audible identity of Pink Floyd. The voice on the records, the guitar that millions would eventually call the most beautiful sound in rock. And he had to do it without ever being allowed the one word that the man he succeeded received for free. Genius. Listen to how the mythology is built. Syd Barrett is the genius, the visionary, the doomed comet. Roger Waters is the genius, the conceptual architect, the bitter prophet, and David Gilmour is, almost always, the craftsman, the technician, the beautiful player, the professional. As though taste were a lesser gift than madness, as though the man who actually built the cathedral mattered less than the man who sketched it on a napkin before disappearing. This is the quiet injustice at the center of the band, and it is worth slowing down to see it clearly. Think about what Gilmour actually did. The guitar solo in Comfortably Numb, which is routinely voted the greatest solo ever recorded, is not a display of speed or difficulty. It is an exercise in restraint, in knowing which notes to leave out, in bending a single string until it sounds like something grieving. That solo does not show off. It mourns. And mourning, it turns out, was the thing Gilmour was hired to do, the thing he did better than anyone, because he had a real and specific person to mourn. The 4-note phrase that opens "Shine on You, you crazy diamond," the phrase Waters said summoned Syd's ghost into the studio the instant it was played, came from Gilmour's hands. He wrote the sound of missing Syd. He, of all people, the one who had to take Syd's place, was given the job of composing the band's longing for the man whose absence had created the vacancy he filled. Sit with the cruelty of that arrangement. A man is brought in to replace his own friend, and then spends the height of his career playing the most famous tribute that friend would ever receive. A tribute the friend was too broken to understand. In June of 1975, while they were mixing that very song at Abbey Road, a heavy, shaven stranger appeared in the control room. And it took the band several minutes to realize they were looking at Syd. Gilmour was in that room. The man who had filled Syd's place stood a few feet from Syd himself, working on a song about how much they all missed him. And Syd, the subject of the song, the original genius, did not understand that any of it was about him. There is no position in the history of rock more impossible than the one David Gilmour occupied in that room. And yet, the band did not merely survive him, it became immortal on his watch. This is the paradox the Savior story cannot hold. Every record the world worships, The Dark Side of the Moon, Wish You Were Here, Animals, The Wall, every one of them was made after Syd was gone. Made by the men who stayed, anchored by the voice and the hands of the man who took his seat. The genius founded the band and gave it nothing the public ever bought in large numbers. The replacement, the so-called craftsman, gave it everything that made it the soundtrack of the second half of the 20th century. If we were honest about what we mean by genius, we would have to admit that the word landed on the wrong man, or at least that it refused to land on the right one. But Gilmour could not have done it alone. And here the story widens into something truer than the cult of any single figure. The sound that Gilmour delivered floated on a bed that someone else built, and that someone was Richard Wright, the atmospheric color that the entire world hears as Pink Floyd, the slow, suspended chords that hang in the air and refuse to resolve. The harmonic weather of those records, that was Wright's authorship, and it is the most systematically forgotten contribution in the band's history. When Gilmour's guitar weeps in Comfortably Numb, it weeps over Wright's harmony. When the four-note phrase summons Syd's ghost, it summons him into a room that Wright had furnished with sound. The tragedy of the replacement is doubled by the tragedy of the unseen author. Two men holding up a myth that the public insisted on hanging entirely on the absent and the embittered. And behind them both sat Nick Mason, the diplomat, the drummer who almost never soloed, who understood that his gift to this particular band was not display, but patience, the steady human pulse that let the others float. 4 men, and the world remembers the genius of the one who left and the rage of the one who fought. While the two who actually held the sound together get the smaller words: craftsman, timekeeper, professional. I want to push on what this does to a life. David Gilmour spent decades being the most identifiable element of one of the most beloved bands ever to exist, and spent those same decades being told, gently, persistently, that he was the steady hand and not the visionary, the one who kept the ship afloat after the real magic had departed. Imagine giving the world its favorite sound and being thanked for your reliability. Imagine that the more beautiful your work became, the more it served as proof of what had been lost, because every gorgeous thing you played was, at bottom, an elegy for someone else. That is the inheritance Gilmour actually received, not a band. A debt to an absence, payable in beauty, with no possibility of ever clearing the balance, because the creditor no longer knew the debt existed. And this is where the Savior story finally collapses under its own comfort. To call Gilmour the man who saved Pink Floyd is to imagine that he arrived, solved a problem, and moved on. But he never moved on. None of them did. Every great record they made after 1968 is, in some buried chamber, another attempt to account for Syd, another verse in a song they could not stop writing. The machine of the music industry that ground him down becomes the subject of Welcome to the Machine. The wounded child who retreats from the world becomes Pink, the hero of the wall. The lost genius is never named again after Shine On, and yet he is everywhere, in every theme of absence and madness, and the unbearable distance between people. Pink Floyd did not survive Syd Barrett. Pink Floyd became a 50-year apparatus for living in his shadow without looking directly at it. And David Gilmour was the man they hired to operate the machinery of that grief. So when we ask what a band owes the genius it had to lose, we are asking the wrong question, because the genius could not collect. The real debt was paid by the one who stayed. It was paid by the man who picked up the guitar of a friend he could not save, who became the sound of a legend that would never quite be his, who composed the world's most famous longing for a person standing silently a few feet away, and who was rewarded for all of it with the faint, dismissive praise we reserve for people who are merely excellent. David Gilmour did not save Pink Floyd. He served its sentence, he carried its grief, he gave it its voice, and was denied its myth. Here is what should keep you here, what should make you want the next one. Every great Pink Floyd record has a ghost inside it, and the ghost always has the same name. And the band spent the rest of their lives refusing to say it out loud. We have only just met the first of those records. There are others. There are always others. And the question I will leave you with is the one the whole story turns on. If the man who created the band could never be honored, and the man who saved it could never be called a genius, then who, in the end, was Pink Floyd actually for? Where art does not console, it autopsies.